Hi students, welcome to lesson 20 Social Mobility in India. Now students, let us start with the introduction of the lesson. Social mobility reveals the degree to which an individual's starting point in life determines their chances in the future and therefore the extent to which talent is rewarded with opportunity. A stronger association between one's starting point and their outcomes in adulthood indicates lower social mobility and fewer meritocracies. In India, realizing the potential of its population will be a key driver of progress and growth. The objectives of the lesson are to know the meaning of social mobility, to learn the trends of social mobility in rural and urban areas. Now let us start with the meaning of social mobility. Social mobility is the extent to which people are able to move between socio-economic strata during their lifetime and between generations. In societies with low social mobility, individual outcomes are strongly determined by their starting point in life. That is, children from privileged backgrounds tend to grow up to be privileged themselves in terms of education, income, wealth and occupation. On the other hand, children from poor families tend to grow up poor themselves. Low social mobility not only erodes the foundation of the growth, it also reduces well-being and puts social cohesion and democratic participation at risk. Now, in societies with high social mobility, individual life chances are not strongly determined by where you come from or who your parents are. In high social mobility societies, children from less well-off backgrounds will have the same chances of achieving their aspirations as those from more advantaged upbringings. Now, measures of social mobility capture the persistence of individual positions over time and the extent to which people can escape from those positions. Now, what is the concept of social mobility? The concept of social mobility is important to study of societies because it is suggestive of equality of opportunity, the idea that while everyone will not have the same outcomes, they should have the same opportunities. Increasing equality of opportunity means addressing the many layers of disadvantage faced by different groups within a population. Increasing social mobility is not only an argument for equality, it is an economic case as well, promoting equality of opportunity and is essential for economic efficiency as it enhances the use of individual talents. The influence of development on intergenerational as well as the intragenerational changes, urban-ward mobility and changes in caste occupations were observed. It is learned that recent advancement promotes simultaneous change in structural components of society as manifested in declining occupational inheritance. The diversification of occupational structure, increased urban-ward movement, change in the composition of population and disassociation of caste and occupational structure. As the level of advancements of a region increase, the proportion of people deviating from parental occupations like caste occupations or attracted towards urban occupations increased. Now, this is somewhat of a social mobility. The above situation has undergone some change in recent years, like factors such as industrial growth, expansion of education, technological advancement, emergence of white collar and caste free occupations and the development of transport and communications have tended to make the caste system less rigid and the people occupationally more mobile. The growth of urban and industrial sector has given rise to several occupational opportunities which did not exist in traditional societies and which promote occupational and geographical mobility in an otherwise static. But the trend of change, however, has not been uniform in all the regions. So, we have been experiencing in Indian society, while some regions and groups witnessed greater mobility, others are relatively static. The advancement of the region and progressiveness of the section seem to have exerted a great influence on the nature and extent of social mobility. Now, what are the trends of social mobility? Social mobility trends in rural areas in the context of regional advancement has not been uniform. When the changes in occupations over 3 generations are examined, artisanry has emerged as an occupation which was least inherited, followed by farming, and evidently these two occupations which involve risk as well as manual labor are being abandoned more than other occupations. But in contrast, the proportion of the population in service occupations and labor, both of which do not involve risk, are expanding. It suggests that people in increasing number are deviating from farming and artisan occupations to join labor or service jobs. The increasing pressure on land due to population growth over the years, combined with the desire to supplement family income and to enhance socio-economic status, seem to be responsible for leaving the occupation of farming. The stigma attached to manual jobs in India is widely known, and those aspiring for higher status society first withdraw their women folk and then their men from active labor participation. Likewise, competition with machine manufactured goods, changes in production techniques and changed preferences have compelled artisans to abandon their occupations and join service or the labor force, which offer an assured income. Now, the slow pace of change in occupational structure is generally attributed to the low development of region. With the development of industries and education, changes in techniques of production and communication and the growth of the service sector, several new opportunities for change in occupation tend to emerge, as because we have been seeing the technological improvement and advancement. Lack of security of income and the possibility of higher wages and positions are mainly responsible for greater mobility of those service and artisans. As farming provides greater security of livelihood and income, as well as the fact that assured alternatives are not easily available, particularly in those cases where people are not well educated, an overwhelming proportion of the respondents tended to remain in the same occupation throughout their life. A further observations, now what are the observations, just we try to understand. The further observations reveals that intergenerational mobility is also greatly influenced by the level of regional development. Like the economic, industrial and social development of the region tended to promote several new caste-free occupations, as also opportunities for greater movement from place to place for seeking better rewards commensurate with one's ability. Now students, let us understand what is urban world movement. Closely associated with inter and intragenerational occupational mobility is the movement of people from one place to another, more so towards urban centers. And obviously, such a movement is directed towards seeking more rewarding jobs. Two major trends can be discerned in respect of occupational mobility, like pattern. One, adopting the occupations that exist in the village itself, like people taking up the occupations of other caste, or two, people turn to urban markets to join new and better occupations. Those turning to urban markets are also of two types, like one, some migrates to the city permanently, and two, others work in the cities but reside in the village. For the latter group, movement to the urban center is a regular feature. Now let us examine changes in the caste occupations. In the matter of occupational mobility, two options are open to rural people. They can either adopt the occupations of caste higher than their own or go into those of the lower caste. There may be three directions in which mobility in occupations may take place in the caste structure. 1. Traditional occupation climbers or adopters of occupations of the caste above them and those who change from traditional to secular occupations. 2. Traditional occupation descendants or adopters of occupations of caste lower than their own, and the third one is traditional occupation followers or adopters of their own caste occupations. These directions were measured on the basis of hierarchically arranged caste groups and along with their traditional occupations. The large proportion of the respondents were rigidly following their occupations, caste occupations. However, some have moved up towards secular occupations or have adopted the occupations of caste higher than their own. So, these reports reveal that this may be because in rural areas adoption of occupations of caste lower than one's own is likely to lead to lowering down of one's prestige in the caste hierarchy. Now, let us examine the income and occupation mobility in India. There are different concepts of mobility that have been described by sociologists and economists that are generally accepted as universal absolute mobility, which refers to whether and by how many children are better off than their parents. Relative mobility, on the other hand, looks at whether offspring are better off than their parents in terms of their position in the distribution. Have children moved up or down the ladder compared to the position of their parents? Intergeneration refers to changes in one's position during their lifetime, while intergeneration is focusing on whether class and income positions are passed on across generations. The loss by emigration of the young people, austerity policies and the territorial concentration of essential services has led many rural areas into a spiral of decline. The growth of regional disparities even among rural areas and depopulation and rural decline are highly associated with remoteness. Accessibility is one key issue to mitigating this erosion of socio-territorial cohesion. Another is mobility, which is the usual way to confront the scarce occupations and limited services in deeply rural territories. In terms of vital opportunities, rural habitat continues to maintain notable differences over urban areas. In this sense, we can speak of the rural gap. On one hand, in the sphere of economic development because of the persistence of the rural penalty. On the other hand, these features of rural habitats, small villages, dispersed population and low density have not allowed an equal integration in the conditions of the welfare state. That is, in rural areas, there are only few employment or consumption opportunities, but also regarding welfare conditions, for example, greater difficulties in the work and the family, reconciliation and accessibility to public services and resources. Now, what is the rural gap? Now, students, let us examine the rural gap in social mobility and the trends towards the mobility. The rural gap is primarily a problem of social inequality, and politically it has turned from being considered as a question of economic development to being seen as an issue of social cohesion. And today, urban-rural differences are expressed in demographic terms. Rural and urban populations are groups with very different living conditions that involve also very different demands for economic participation, consumption and well-being. The principle of a uniform configuration of the supply of services in the face of the real diversity of territorial situations predetermines the accessibility to public goods and resources aimed at the reduction of inequalities. The decrease in accessibility involves a greater demand for mobility and makes mobility a source of new inequalities that feed back the vicious circle of the process of progressive of agrarization, and the creation of multifunctional rurality has been generating a situation of strong territorial imbalance in the demographic distribution. It is not a just mere transfer of the rural population to the urban, and industrial areas, but a rural restructuring. It is also evident that the depopulation of the inland regions has repercussions for the vital capacity and the economic development of the territories. But nevertheless, within the context of the welfare state, the loss of political weight of the territories and their inhabitants has become even more remarkable. The territorial imbalance brings important inequalities in political opportunities, and lower demographic weight implies less political strength. But in practice, it means a weak construction of citizenship in the small towns and regions, because the territorial balance and the regular maintenance of the population in the territory is a condition of social cohesion. But in this sense, the rural gap can be interpreted in terms of social cohesion. On the one hand, the demographic shortfalls prevent rural areas from achieving. In the current context of progress towards a knowledge-based economy, this social capital is especially crucial in the lesser disposition of it in rural areas, which ends up concentrating innovation processes in urban areas. As a consequence, the marginalization of rural areas increases. On the other hand, the distribution of welfare policies based on aggregate demand criteria and in the face of territorial equilibrium criteria, which implies unequal access by the rural population to public services. But within the inequalities generated by depopulation combined with territorial disadvantages, demographic imbalance are central. It is not simply the loss of population, but particularly of young people, but at the same time the relationship among the generations becomes profoundly altered. Depopulation areas are heavily aged but also masculine at the young age. The rural areas are in a situation of clear demographic imbalance, that is the result of a very selective migratory balance. Rural masculinization is only a sample of the gender differences in opportunities produced by some factors that characterize the rural areas, like the restricted labor markets for women and particularly for qualified jobs, and the reduced opportunity to access to care resources for children and elder people. Aging and masculinization define rural family structures, and low fertility is a second aspect of the second demographic transition that conditions the size of the new generations and directly affects the numerical strength among the generations. This imbalance entails the reorganization of relations among the generations through systems of interaction, among which the family stands out. In this way, the changes related to the care of the elderly deeply affect the way in which families organize themselves. It is not only fertility which has been reduced, but also the age for commencing motherhood has been delayed in a way that the distance between generations is greater. This increase in the distance between generations can be understood from the perspective of the chains of care as an adaptive process. The children will not be so old when the parents reach the fourth age, and in turn, those parents who become grandparents will also help the upbringing of their grandchildren. To a large extent, and especially in rural areas, the upkeep of aging population process has been transferred mainly to families and particularly to women and groups such as the denominated support generation. Access to the personal car has led to a progressive permeability of the territory, blurring the countryside and the city, as well as some of the traditional rural disadvantages. But it is its generalization that exceptionally increases accessibility for many and allows for the settlement of strategic groups such as the youth and women, and it also establishes its own forms of exclusion and immobilization for others, and it erodes the public transport systems. Automobility options are crucial for stimulating social cohesion and jumping the rural group. However, because of this fundamental importance of the car in rural areas, it has also become a key driver in the creation of new social inequalities. The significance of mobility in disadvantaged and demographically vulnerable regions has been stressed by the challenges presented by public transport in these regions, which accumulate the effects of all the processes. On the one hand, most aging and sparsely populated areas, mountain regions and regions with problems of accessibility, areas that undergo deterioration of services and local economies are those which depend to a great degree on the efficiency of public transport systems. On the other hand, the cost of these services due to the previous aforementioned characteristics, the fluctuation of the demand on the erosion that the private automobile entails make their organization especially problematic. The traditional considerations regarding the immobilize of rural societies have prevented an appreciation of how they have become confined during recent decades to an intensification of the daily mobilities. Furthermore, some studies have described rural daily mobility as hypermobility, and in this sense we can consider that the deployment of forms under which the transition to other paradigms of mobility, shared, autonomous, unconventional, that are currently underway, and these will largely determine the future of these areas and rural groups. A transition that due to its characteristics offers good opportunities for addressing the present mobility needs of these regions. On demand, buses and taxis, shared transportation systems and collective cars like social mobility is the extent to which people are able to move between socio-economic strata during their lifetime and between generations. In societies with low social mobility, individual outcomes are strongly determined by their starting point in life. The discriminatory geographies are neutralized in urban areas through infrastructures and collective transport networks, which make the right to mobility effective. However, in rural regions, the mobility question has become a more complex problem. Rural areas as a whole make up sociological environments that are more isolated and vulnerable, but that are highly demanding of services such as healthcare systems and mobility. Finally, it is a world largely supported by private monitoring. It is a dependence on the car that allows inhabitants to face up to and rebalance some of the previous disadvantages. For example, access to employment or external training, although this also leads to new inequalities. The adequacy of mobility and transition to new models can provide more equal conditions for the inhabitants of rural areas. However, just as the commitment to innovation and economic development has been able to stop the depopulation and rural decline, it may be in the same way presumed that mobility and attention to accessibility cannot guarantee territorial rebalancing either. The rural challenge shows the depth of territorial imbalances and the strong association they have with demographic imbalances. The social agenda to face this challenge must interpret the demographic imbalance in terms of the generational relationships that constitute the basis of social sustainability. Beyond the material issues of economic opportunities and access to well-being, what really shows the generational gaps and the strong asymmetry between men and women in areas of low density and population dispersion is the difficulty of establishing and maintaining and developing vital projects in rural areas. Rural policies needs to include the question of improving the attractiveness of rural areas for the development of life projects. With regard to this objective, the transition of mobility must be included. The transition should be considered within the logic of not only of the management of displacements, but also a key mechanism to favor gender equality and generational diversity. Mobility must be thought out and organized for the purpose of conciliation, health, education, leisure, etc., which attend to the different ways of life purposes. Mobility is a way lessen the rural gap. Students, now let us sum up with the lesson. Social mobility is the extent to which people are able to move between socio-economic strata during their lifetime and between generations. In societies with low social mobility, individual outcomes are strongly determined by their starting point in life. Social mobility is the extent to which people are able to move between socio-economic strata during their lifetime and between generations. In societies with low social mobility, individual outcomes are strongly determined by their starting point in life. Thank you.